Welcome to our monthly Georgia State University Prevention Research Center Brownbag Seminar. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Prevention Research Centers, PRCs, this is a CDC-funded network of academic research facilities in the United States that study how people and their communities can avoid or counter the risks of chronic illnesses. And the PRC at Georgia State University, headquartered on the Clarkston campus at Perimeter College, works with community organizations, state and local governments, residents, and other partners in Clarkston, Georgia to develop, implement, and evaluate culturally and linguistically appropriate interventions to address disparities and determinants of health for migrants and refugees, and to then disseminate this work at the community, state, and national level. We invite you to visit our website, prc.gsu.edu, to sign up for our newsletter. And there you can also email us if you're interested in learning more about our center or getting involved with our work. So now I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today, Dr. Randy Capps. Dr. Capps is Director of Research for U.S. Programs at the Migration Policy Institute. His areas of expertise include immigrants and their well-being, immigrant healthcare and public benefits access and use. And Dr. Capps is initially trained as a demographer and has published widely on immigrant integration at the state and local level, and has examined the impact of the detention and deportation of immigrant parents on children. Today, Dr. Capps will be talking about the current immigration climate and policy environment, and what refugee, immigrant, and migrant policy changes have already occurred and are anticipated to occur under the new Biden administration. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Capps.
Thanks, Ashley, very much, and thank you everyone for joining today. I think I'll start with some background on how we got to where we are in terms of policy issues. Not going to spend much time on demographic and political issues, which are much more of an underlying set of conditions. But if we look at why we have such controversial immigration policies that keep changing so rapidly and so unpredictably, a bottom line issue is the lack of congressional action. So our current immigration system was legislated in 1965, which coincidentally is the year I was born. We had a big legalization program in '86. We had some further expansions in legal immigration in 1990 and some restrictions in 1996, but it's been 25 or 30 years since there's been major immigration legislation in Congress. And we had failed attempts at it in 2000, 2007, and 2013. So that's left a void. And into that void, we've seen increasingly aggressive action by the executive and more court challenges to policy. So for most of this last 25 to 30 year period, there has been a pretty broad consensus around legal immigration. Like, we admit for green cards more than 1 million people each year, primarily for family, also for economic and diversity reasons. That has been generally supported by Republican and Democratic presidents. And the refugee admissions system has been in place since 1980, also generally with broad-based support. There was a breakdown in consensus, though, starting in the 1990s around what to do about the unauthorized immigrant population and around enforcement of that, as well as the border, and that's been controversial for longer. But what happened with the Trump, starting with the Trump campaign, was really the first time we saw a presidential candidate go out and really try to change the discussion around immigrants from all backgrounds. This is part of the populism, and it was aimed specifically at Mexican and Central American refugees and asylum seekers, as well as African and Middle Eastern refugees. And this kind of busted the consensus on legal immigration that we've had in presidential administrations, as well as the ongoing debates over unauthorized migration. He also hired ideologically committed, and this is really important, knowledgeable and competent people in his administration with a focus on immigration from day one through day zero, the last day of the administration. There were immigration policy changes literally almost every day. and consistency in that too, even though Attorney General Sessions didn't last. He was there for most of the administration, and Stephen Miller was in the White House straight through from beginning to end. Trump had 3 executive orders in his first week, the famous so-called Muslim ban and refugee reductions, as well as border security and interior enforcement executive orders. This was the first time we'd seen this level of attention. The Obama administration, Bush administration had done things administratively, sometimes at the cabinet level, but usually at the sub-cabinet level. This was the president himself signing executive orders and raising these immigration issues to the very top of the policy agenda. It was also the fastest pace of change we've ever seen, 3 major executive orders in a week. But that was followed up with extensive policy memos, rulemaking, precedent setting by the attorneys general who have control over the immigration courts, so they could set the rules around how asylum cases, for instance, are handled. We documented over 400 policy changes, big and small. Others have documented over 1,000 when they really get into the weeds. So it is really a huge number of changes the Trump administration put into place. In general, they enhanced the power of the enforcement agencies, that's ICE and Border Patrol, but they also really dismantled a lot of the functioning of the benefits agencies, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the Department of State Consular Services overseas. Also, there were numerous challenges in court of many of these policies, and those challenges may have succeeded at first, but in the main, most of the Trump administration's changes went through the courts, and that's because basically without congressional action, there's wide latitude given to presidents on immigration policy. And then finally, of course, we had the pandemic, which accelerated everything with almost total closures of the border, expulsions of almost everyone coming across the border illegally, and very large reductions in the processing of visas and bans on admitting many groups of immigrants legally. And those remained in place for about the last 6 to 9 months of the Trump administration. So with the Biden administration, we've seen an even more rapid and aggressive effort to change immigration policies than we saw with Trump. He's now signed 11 executive orders within the first couple of weeks, 8 on Inauguration Day itself. And he has outlined a very ambitious immigration reform proposal that would legalize close to all of the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the country and substantially increase legal immigration. He's also hired very competent people. Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security, has extensive experience on the enforcement and on the USCIS side. He's accompanied by a lot of very trusted hands in the White House and in general, people with a very progressive viewpoint. So I want to look at 4 areas in particular that would affect immigrant and refugee communities there locally. Refugee policies, asylum policies, immigration enforcement, and public charge. So on refugees, Biden started with an executive order rescinding all those country-specific bans. And that's in effect, that's something that was relatively easy to do because those specific country bans were really kind of an outlier in terms of immigration policy. He's also pledged to increase the refugee ceiling, which the Trump administration in the latest year set at 15,000, which is the lowest it's been since 1980, to back up to 125,000, which is where it would have been if there had been a Hillary Clinton administration. That's going to take a little bit longer for several reasons. First, it's not clear. These ceilings are set by the administration with the authority of Congress once a year, and we're midway through that year. Second, Trump really dismantled, as I mentioned earlier, those agencies that are responsible for vetting and screening refugees overseas. The funding, as you well know, for resettlement across the country has declined dramatically with the reduction in refugee admissions. So basically the capacity to screen and resettle refugees has to be rebuilt almost from scratch. And that's going to take quite a long time with the added complication of the ongoing pandemic requiring additional health screening and measures. So I would also note that, because of the issues at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and the consular services overseas, there are latest estimates, 1/3 of a million people in the backlog overseas waiting for their green cards to be completed. And, you know, it could take months, if not years, to get through that backlog, even after rehiring is done. So that's one of the biggest issues with refugee and other legal immigration admissions is going to be capacity. Now, asylum is really complicated. There were all sorts of restrictions on asylum at all different points in the process during the Trump administration, and unraveling all of those, you know, that's a lifetime occupation for a lot of people. Both of the attorney generals, as I mentioned earlier, issued these opinions that are binding on immigration judges, in particular narrowing asylum and focusing on gender and gang-related violence claims, which tend to be common among Central Americans, but also could be common among other world regions. Now, Biden's recent executive order instructed, you know, the Department of Justice to review this and to try to make make precedents that would allow gender and violence, gang violence related claims go forward. That probably will take some time though. And then there were just all these policies at the border, you know, the Remain in Mexico or migrant protection policies that sent asylum seekers to Mexico, the recent expulsions, the family separation, these agreements with Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador to send asylum seekers there on airplanes, and a number of other policies. Well, most of those have actually been withdrawn in these executive orders or in the process of being withdrawn. And additionally, Mexico has played a critical role under extreme pressure from the Trump administration economically and politically. López Obrador, the president of Mexico, agreed to allow people from other countries to await asylum hearings in Mexico, agreed to accept them back when they're expelled, and agreed to try to stop them from crossing through Mexico. All of which was very effective, and they're starting to back out of that. The first sign that Mexico might change their policy, they just announced this week that they're no longer going to accept families and children expelled from the United States onto their territory. So that's the first sign of a change in Mexico's role in all of this. You know, I should say that a couple of things. First of all, overall, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is what's going to be most difficult for the Biden administration. If they open up too quickly on the border without having a more efficient asylum system in place, and that's a long-standing issue we could spend a lot of time talking about, the millions, nearly 1 million people, I think, maybe more than 1 million at last count, who are still waiting for their asylum cases in the immigration court system. But without being able to show they can control the border with changes in policies that essentially invite more people to come from Central America, if we have a repeat of 2014 and 2015 with Fox News and others showing that, you know, visual images of the border being out of control, that's going to play back into politics. And I know the Biden administration is very concerned about that, as they should be. Another thing worth mentioning is that even though the refugees and asylum seekers that you see there locally primarily come from African Asian countries, mostly they overstay visas, they don't come across the border. Increasing numbers have been. In the last couple of years, we've seen up to something like 10% of the apprehensions at the US-Mexico border in some months being from regions of the world other than Mexico and Central America, and we expect those numbers to increase. So the border policies could affect some people in your local community. The third issue is ICE enforcement. This is an area where theoretically the president and the administration have a lot of power. So the Trump administration, in one of their first executive orders, reset the policies about whom ICE could arrest, detain, and deport to include virtually all unauthorized immigrants. And I know you've heard about this locally. It has also included some legal immigrants, including refugees, that have been convicted of a certain narrow set of crimes defined in immigration law called aggravated felonies. And I was there in 2017 in Clarkston and heard about some Somalis that have been arrested and detained based on that. What you saw also in Georgia and some other states was state legislation in several counties like Cobb, Gwinnett, Hall, and Whitfield that embraced ICE enforcement and actually cooperated with them. But you also had other states like California, other cities, big cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston that didn't want to cooperate with ICE and really push back on that. And so you kind of had that tension going on with ICE enforcement during the Trump administration. And that that narrowed the scope of what Trump could do nationwide, even though I know the Atlanta office was one of the most aggressive ICE offices in the country during that administration. Now, the Biden administration issued 2 executive orders, a moratorium on deportation and narrower enforcement priorities that were focused on people convicted. Again, that's that narrow set of aggravated felonies. Even if they were unauthorized immigrants, they would have to be convicted of a very narrow set of more serious crimes. Of course, and this is actually interestingly narrower than what we saw during the Obama administration. It's also the first time that I can remember that we've had an outright moratorium on deportations in all but a limited number of circumstances. But there's pushback on that too. So now the shoe's on the other foot, right? The Trump administration was, at war with California and other jurisdictions, and now it's Texas and Arizona. Those 2 states now have sued to stop the moratorium on deportations. They have been successful in getting a temporary restraining order that's going to be for 2 weeks, or was in the middle of that 2-week period, I guess, but may get extended. This is based on some very creative agreements that the Trump administration's acting Homeland Secretary, Ken Cuccinelli, who not coincidentally was Attorney General in Virginia, who was very aggressive on immigration enforcement there. He signed these agreements with states that give the states basically a veto power over changing federal enforcement priorities, which is something entirely new. We'll see how that goes through the courts, but they found a sympathetic judge in Texas, a Trump-appointed judge, by the way. So you see how these things go around and around. And we just learned too that the ICE union, so here we have ICE officers who've taken politics and policies into their own hands through their union. They were very active in the Trump campaign. They were very active and aggressive in the Trump administration. And now they've signed their own agreement with Ken Cuccinelli on the way out the door of the Homeland Security Department that says that they have veto power over changing the rules around who gets arrested, detained, and deported. That hasn't been tested in court yet. So what looked like where Trump did it and where Obama had done it before him, that the Biden administration could flip a switch and stop the arrests and deportations. Now that's not so sure because of this pushback. It's interesting, Georgia kind of was on the very aggressive end of the state politics around enforcement. But it's notable that, common Gwinnett counties are where kind of the earth-shattering change in Georgia politics that affected the makeup of the Senate. A lot of that had to do with the swing in voters in those 2 populous counties. And not coincidentally, those 2 counties withdrew their agreements to cooperate with ICE, the 287G agreements. And so I'm sensing that Georgia may not be one of the more aggressive states like Texas and Arizona when it comes to fighting the Biden administration's immigration agenda. We'll see about that. Then finally, there's the public charge rule. There's a long-standing statute in immigration law that says, and this goes back really more than a century, immigrants who are likely to become dependent on the government for their assistance can be excluded. And the term officially is inadmissible. It could be inadmissible. They could be denied green cards based on this dependency. It had been interpreted very narrowly until the Trump administration as primary dependence on cash assistance. And as you may know, the TANF, the cash assistance program, is a very small program, or institutionalization at government expense. But the Trump administration issued a rule that changed this to include any use of benefits as opposed to dependence on them, and included food stamps and Medicaid, which are the 2 largest federal benefits program, as well as a forward-looking test if anyone is likely to use these benefits in the future because they're poor, or they're unemployed, or they're old, or they're sick, and a number of other things, then they might also be prevented from getting green cards. It's sort of a backdoor way to reduce family reunification through the green card process of lower income immigrants from certain countries. That's been in the courts, but it went through a very long period of rule writing, extensive commenting, and because of that, it's very hard to overturn. The Biden administration really has to do their homework on this one because the Trump administration did their homework. If they don't have adequate justification and they're not careful in how they write it in relationship to the law, the courts could easily overturn it. Now, what you've probably heard about in your community is the combination of the ICE enforcement uptick and the public charge rule has scared a lot of immigrants off from getting benefits. And national research has suggested that, you know, a sixth of all immigrant families and upwards of, you know, a quarter to a third of those with non-citizens in them are afraid to use these benefit programs. We and others have shown there have been major drops in food stamp and Medicaid use, even during, we don't know about during the pandemic because those data are not out yet. So communicating these issues is really important too. And that's been another thing that is in the Biden executive order, and the advocates have been asking for, is more clarity. Refugees and asylees are not the statute that allows for this public charge exclusion, specifically excludes refugees, asylees, and other humanitarian admissions. They have no reason to fear from this, just as in the 1990s with the welfare reform law, their eligibility for benefits was never restricted. But refugees and asylees don't know that. And they may even live in families with people with other statuses. So that's been a big issue, sort of overcoming that chilling effect on refugees, asylees, and other legal immigrants has been a big issue as well. So those were the issues I wanted to discuss. I wanted to leave plenty of time for question and answer. So I'm ready to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Capps. I would like to open it up to questions. Please, if you're able to, continue to use the chat function and stay muted, please, unless you're wanting to ask a question and cannot use the chat. And I will monitor the chat and pose questions and comments to Dr. Capps that way. I'll go ahead and start us off, Dr. Capps, with a question posed by Michael Erickson, who's the overall PI for the PRC here. And he says, thank you for taking the time to brief us on the political context of refugee resettlement. What can you say about what a community like Clarkston can expect over the next year? How many refugees might be resettled and from which countries? I know it would be a guess, but what do you think would be most likely? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say what the pace will be. You know, as I mentioned, I think starting it up is going to take some time. I don't imagine the numbers are going to be very large. You know, usually it's toward the end of the fiscal year that you see more refugees coming in. I think we could hope that by this summer there would be more. I do think the pandemic is going to affect that. The pandemic affects the ability of people to go out and do the screening. It affects the public health screening that needs to take place. It's going to affect the overall climate in terms of excluding people coming into the U.S. But equally important, you know, that one of Biden's executive orders is about basically rebuilding U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and that just has to happen first. They have to rehire, retrain, and redeploy what they call the circuit riders that go around the world and do those interviews, and they have to go through the vetting process again. And they're going to have to be careful. They're going to have to figure out how they could streamline it, because, you know, it takes a year or two. It's highly likely, unfortunately, that the numbers will be still very, very small by the end of this fiscal year because of all those constraints. And then, of course, there's the issue of capacity locally and how to fund rebuild the resettlement agencies. That will probably come, because it probably will be a gradual ramping up. There's so many people that are in the pipeline that got stopped. I would imagine some of the family with members of people already resettled. Those are some of the easier cases to resettle because their families have already been vetted. So it'll be family members of refugees that are there locally, that from the same origins, of course, that I would expect would be among the first. And then it's probably some of the same countries that have been coming in fairly large numbers recently. And I'm not as up to date on that as I should be. I know DRC has been a major country there. I think Eritrea, you know, Myanmar, the Rohingya and other refugees from there, maybe Afghanistan as well, might be among those. But I haven't, because of these great restrictions on refugee admission numbers, we haven't really seen what would be a usual pattern, and it could have changed in the last couple of years.
Thank you. Other questions? I guess while people are thinking about what you said, Dr. Capps. I want to just kind of follow up on a point you just made about kind of what it's going to take to rebuild the resettlement, the screening and resettlement infrastructure that Trump really decimated. Certainly you mentioned kind of funding and training. I'm just thinking, what are some of the other needs that are going to have to be met in order to rebuild that massive system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the funding, it's the training, it's getting people from the immigrant and refugee community back involved in that. Actually, some of the work that you guys are doing may help in that sense, that the additional investments in public health infrastructure in immigrant and refugee communities now, it's some, I'm sure some of the same organizations and some people with some of the same sets of skills that are needed, to be community health workers right now that you would also have in refugee resettlement case managers, for instance. And so there may be a way too that this stimulus legislation that may get through Congress by reconciliation that's supposed to have state and local government assistance and have some funding for public health in it. The details of how that gets allocated, I think, will be really interesting to see if this administration does build more of a robust community health infrastructure. It would be great to see some of that really focused on immigrant and refugee communities, and I think it probably would be in some places. Now, of course, in the in the context of Georgia as a state that hasn't been as supportive of immigrants in the past, although that, I think Georgia's been one of the states that's been very supportive for refugee resettlement for most of the recent past. If the money is channeled through the state, that may be more difficult in your case than if there are direct federal grants to localities or to agencies.
Another question, Dr. Capps, can you say a word about how resettled refugees fare within the larger context of immigration? If an individual goes through the vetting associated with resettlement, are they entitled to more or different benefits or protection? Or are all refugee immigrant migrants treated the same from a legal perspective and benefit standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, they're very different rules, and with the refugee resettlement program and this aspect of the refugee resettlement program was not dismantled by the Trump administration because it is set in law. Refugees get initial resettlement assistance, cash assistance, and housing and such as then medical assistance as well when they are first resettled. And then they're eligible for ongoing assistance for several months and potentially for longer than that in the case of the food stamp program or TANF for families, cash assistance for families and Medicaid, given that they're income eligible. There's no bar on their eligibility for these programs, whereas regularly resettled immigrants, the green card holders that come in are the lawful permanent residents in this, I believe in the state of Georgia, if they're adults, they're barred for 5 years from getting food stamps, and they're barred for 5 years from getting Medicaid, as it is the case in a lot of other states. I'm not sure about children in Medicaid. I know children can get food stamps. So, refugees are connected to these programs and they're eligible in a way that other legal immigrants are not. And then you have unauthorized immigrants who are excluded altogether, although their family members can get benefits. So it's quite common to have a household with, say, 2 unauthorized immigrant parents or recent legal immigrant parents who are not eligible for food stamps, but 2 U.S. citizen children. And so in that case, if they're income eligible, they'll get a lower amount of, not exactly half, but it's close to half of the benefits that they would otherwise get if everyone was an eligible immigrant. This has also come out during the Affordable Care Act. All lawfully present immigrants. It's a broader group than legal immigrant than the green card holders. It includes refugees. It would include asylum seekers once they have work authorization. They're eligible for the Affordable Care Act subsidized health insurance coverage, and that's going to be a big issue now that the Biden administration is going to reinstitute an open enrollment period, and hopefully there'll be more outreach conducted. So Unauthorized immigrants are not eligible. DACA recipients are not eligible, but basically all other classes of lawfully present immigrants are eligible for Affordable Care Act. And then you've got, of course, the stimulus payments. There was a lot of debate over this. The earlier ones under the CARES Act in the spring, an unauthorized immigrant can't get a payment because they don't have a social security number. It's based on taxes. These stimulus payments go through the tax system. But also the kids and spouses living with them, even if they were legal immigrants, couldn't get the payments. And they've rectified that to some degree, and now those spouses and most of those children can. But unauthorized immigrants are still excluded. Refugees absolutely should be eligible if they're income eligible for these stimulus payments. Many should be getting them automatically, but they could also apply for them when they do their taxes this year. And we're waiting on the third round of stimulus payments, of course, in this legislation being debated right now.
Thank you. Okay, so a question from Matthew Lyons. He says, a question about your wish list. It seems clear that there is a need for congressional action on immigration, with the caveat that sweeping reform may be unlikely in this partisan environment. What should the general structure of that immigration law overhaul look like, in your opinion? More specifically, what changes are needed with regard to refugee policy?
So refugee policy doesn't factor in a major way into that immigration reform debate, and neither does asylum policy. That's a separate conversation we could have about reforming asylum policy. I think there's general agreement and probably not a huge amount of pushback on the Republican side of the aisle that the Biden administration would have the authority to restart the refugee program as it was. And these specific country bans have been lifted. So we can assume it's more of an implementation issue, not an issue of lack of congressional authority to restart the refugee program. Asylum is a little more complicated. Again, we could talk about that separately. To general immigration reform, I would instruct you to visit our website, because we just issued a report about this morning, and there was at 10 o'clock. Some of you may have seen it. The issue being that what's on the table as a marker on the progressive side from the Biden administration is legalizing 11 million people who've been here, basically, as Stuart Verdery, who was the Republican on the panel, said, since Christmas, right? So it's almost everybody. That does have a very low probability of passing. What has a high probability of passing is the DACA dreamers, the unauthorized immigrants who came as children and meet certain educational qualifications. And there's already support from Senator Cornyn from Texas, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina may be on board with that, probably Mitt Romney. There's probably already a handful of senators for that. So what's in between, 700,000 dreamers or maybe slightly more to a million, or if you increase eligibility scope a little bit versus 11 million. Well, there's a lot of debate around essential workers, and in the context of pandemic legislation, this was mentioned on the call this morning by the Democrat on the panel. If there's a third round of stimulus or a second round under the Biden administration that goes through reconciliation, they may be able to make the case that legalizing essential workers has enough of a budget impact that it could be included under budget rules in a reconciliation bill. Essential workers, it depends on your definition. It's clearly health workers, it may be grocery store workers. In some definitions, it's like upwards of 2/3 of the entire workforce of the US. So there will be a debate around who's an essential worker, whether or not that should qualify people. And then you've got other small populations that have certain constituencies in favor of them, temporary protected status. That's 300,000 or so, mostly Salvadoran, Haitians, and Hondurans that have, fled natural disasters years ago. They're able to keep renewing TPS, they're able to work, but putting them on a pathway to citizenship is on the table. And then agricultural workers are always an issue. I know this is in the state of Georgia, there's a significant migrant worker population, and there's a shortage. I mean, there's the H-2A, temporary agricultural worker program has grown by leaps and bounds, even under the Trump administration. So there is some talk of potentially legalizing some group of unauthorized immigrant agricultural workers. Now, that's one side of it. Again, as we discussed on the call today, what do you get in exchange for that? More enforcement. Well, there's already so much border enforcement. The Democrats aren't going to be willing to build a wall in exchange for legalizing people. That's probably off the table. Or we already have so many border patrol officers, except in the most unusual circumstances, they're tripping over each other. On the call this morning, it was mentioned that, well, maybe there should be more interior enforcement. Well, people are pushing for less. So I don't know if that trade-off will fly. People have talked about better verification of who's actually eligible to work through this electronic e-verify system, expanding that. And then, of course, there's the debates around what to do about legal immigration. If you legalize people that have been here, what do you do with people who want to come in the future? And people argue on one side that you need to let more people come in legally. You actually need to increase the number of work visas, particularly for people with low skills, because they would come across the border illegally if they didn't come on a valid visa. I mean, that's what we've seen again with the H-2A agricultural program. More of those visas helped kind of stem the flow, particularly of Mexican unauthorized. But a larger program like that, temporary or permanent, might be on the table. But then you're going to have pushback, again, from the other side of the aisle, who are saying, again, this is explicit on the call this morning, the more immigrants you let in and legalize and become citizens, the more Democratic voters you get. I mean, that's not necessarily a truism, but it's a very important foundational myth almost for the Republican Party right now. And it is true to a certain degree, even though in this last election we saw it wasn't that true in Florida and Texas. A lot of Latinos who naturalized citizens did vote for Trump more than in the past. It's not a given. We know the Karl Roves of the world, Senator Cornyn from Texas, the whole Bush wing of the party don't agree with his philosophy, but most Republicans do. So where that works its way back into the politics of immigration reform is, what's the bottom line? How many more immigrants are we going to admit? Are we going to let 11 million stay, and we're going to clear backlogs of several million people more and expand the number to 1.5 million per year? That suddenly becomes a huge number of new immigrants who are potential Democratic voters. So I think you'll see some push to try to restrict legal immigration in exchange for legalization. That was what was on the table during the Trump administration. Cut certain categories like the diversity visa program, the farther out, like the adult siblings, preferences in the family-based system. That might get on the table too. It's very complicated. All these factors come into play. It won't simply be a broad legalization bill, and that's why I think even the most progressive advocates are saying, if we could just get a DREAM Act passed, that would be a great first start. It's so simple, it's so clean, it has a lot of Republican support, it's a modest number. Let's start there.
Yeah, that makes sense. A question from Whitney. Has there been any indication from the Biden administration of a timeline for reopening the overseas USCIS processing offices that were closed in the past few years?
Yeah, I haven't seen the details on that yet. I mean, the executive order instructs USCIS to review and basically get things going again as quickly as possible, but I don't have a sense of what the exact timeline is.
A question from Carlos. There are established refugee resettlement sites, like Metro Atlanta. Can you comment, or do you know of new emerging refugee settlement sites, and what can these sites learn from each other?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, of course, the refugee resettlement systems had kind of two components: this family reunification component, which tends to concentrate refugees, with their family members where you already have existing refugee populations. And that's also somewhat bolstered by the secondary migration of refugees who resettle elsewhere and move to be often with people from similar communities. But then you have the deliberate dispersal of refugee resettlement of the free cases that don't have family members in the U.S. Across most states in the country. So there's a long experience with sending small numbers of refugees into different diverse communities. I don't know, because I haven't followed what's happened with the refugee resettlement infrastructure. My assumption is it will be much more difficult for those communities that resettled fewer people to get back up and running again. They may not have any capacity at all left in certain parts of the country, as opposed to a major hub like Clarkston, where there's enough latent capacity, people doing other related things, enough of a cell of an infrastructure in place to restart. I would assume that, places like Clarkston will get refugees in larger numbers earlier on. The process is generally the voluntary agencies meet with the Department of State nationally on a regular basis and discuss who goes where based on capacity. Another wrinkle on this, which we haven't heard about for some time, but this preceded the Trump administration. In the later years of the Obama administration, you started to have some Republican governors rejecting refugee resettlement in their states. Texas dismantled its official refugee resettlement system. There were some objections by the governor, but the local governments took it over in a few places. We may see some more pushback if refugee numbers get big again. It depends on how the debate about immigrants and refugees looks 6 months, 9 months, a year from now. But it's possible it could be, it might not even be a bad move with limited numbers of refugees, that they'll go more so to some states that are more supportive than the states that are in opposition. And again, I don't know where Georgia is going to stand on that. It'll be interesting to see which way the state government goes on these kind of issues.
So my co-director for community engagement for our PRC work, Mary Helen O'Connor, had a question.
I'm trying to get out of.
Someone's muted, needs to mute. So Mary Helen said, many of my undergraduate students just learning about migration are on this presentation. Could you broadly comment on how drastic cuts to migration, visas, international students, refugees, immigrants might affect the US?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would start by saying that despite all of the changes up until the pandemic, so up until last spring, the Trump administration had actually not succeeded in drastically cutting immigration to the US. It had succeeded in drastically cutting refugee admissions, but there was such a large number of asylum seekers coming across the border during 2018 and 2019, primarily from Central America, but again, some others from other rural regions, that almost outweighed the cut in refugees. So there really actually was a substantial number of people coming in there. There was also an increase in the number of agricultural workers, as I mentioned, on temporary visas. A pretty steady number for like the high-skilled H-1B visas. There was not much of a cutback on that side. The numbers of international students did drop a lot, and of course, in the university setting, you see that. That was due to some of these country bans. It was due to the rhetoric of the Trump administration, and even towards the end, some very specific policies that made it harder to come and remain in the country as a student. On the green card application, side, there actually was pretty high volume of that throughout most of the Trump administration leading up to the pandemic. And because on a lot of those categories, there are caps and there are waiting lists, there were so many people still waiting and coming in large numbers that it was still running at the pace of 1 million a year. We didn't see much of a slowdown there until the pandemic, but then, there was that gap in USCIS processing when the offices shut down. There's a gap in consular processing. It never really was rebuilt. So you have like a 6 to 9 month period with massively reduced numbers, and we haven't seen the statistics on that, but for sure, 2020 would be a record low level in legal immigrant admissions to the US. But again, primarily due to the pandemic and associated dismantling of these agencies, not necessarily to Trump reduction policies. I mentioned the public charge rule that has the possibility of excluding a substantial share of green card applicants going forward, but that rule went into effect for any application accepted after February of last year. And the backlog is so long now that it's unlikely that very many of those are being processed under that rule. And it's probably likely that the Biden administration will succeed in either overturning or ameliorating that rule before it can take much effect. So in the long term, it looks like we're going to have a year-long major gap in admissions. and a several years long gap in refugee admissions that will change within a year or two. Demographically speaking, we do need immigrants. Like most other wealthy countries in the world, we have had a declining birth rate. Immigration, and especially birth immigrant families, was, until the last big recession in 2008, really keeping pace with population growth and keeping it at or above a replacement level, which is something more than 2 kids per family. And the 2008 recession changed that. People are having fewer kids since that recession, and that includes immigrant families. So there was a while when, if you look at the statistics, immigration numbers fluctuate because you've also got illegal immigration, and that fluctuates. You have a consistent number of green card holders, but you have these other fluctuations, and they're subject to policy. But you also had this momentum that the children in immigrant families were being born in significant numbers every year. What we demographers call the second generation. The biggest component of future workforce growth is actually that second generation of children of immigrants. There's more people coming of age 18 with immigrant parents and entering the labor force than there are, these other groups. So we would have a declining labor force within the next 5, 10, 15 years. It's very imminent if we didn't have immigration of the children of immigrants. But we've seen this slow down. And so actually the number of children of immigrants under age 18 is actually held steady and started to decline. And just as the number of immigrants has kind of leveled off. So I think we will, for a few years post-pandemic, in a weaker economy, continue to see these trends. It will take a while for immigrant numbers to get back up, and that will impede the rebound in economic growth. It will make it more difficult to get back up to the clip of overall GDP growth that we had before the pandemic. It's very strong in 2019, of course, one of the strongest years on record. How that plays out against unemployment, I don't know. There are a lot of factors involved in unemployment. There's competition between immigrants and other workers, but there's also complementarity. Right, that immigrants do certain jobs that create economic activity that lead to the hiring of other workers. And so it's not clear which way that will go in terms of affecting unemployment.
So Dr. Erickson had another question that was almost identical to my final question for you, which is, what advice do you have for a university like Georgia State that is working collaboratively with a refugee resettlement community, and that may have implications for generalizability to other refugee communities in the US and globally?
Well, actually, we spoke about this before last week, which is, this pandemic is a stress test for society, but it's also, opportunity to experiment with new methods to get healthcare, other forms of assistance, promotion for economic and cultural integration out to immigrant and refugee communities. You're well poised to do that because you have this funding source and some programs in place already to look at things like hiring community health workers. I think there's a couple of issues that just interest me from an immigration point of view that are related, that we're doing some research on in other communities, which is, how do you get that message out there about the need to get tested for the coronavirus and get vaccinated? How do you overcome the misinformation that's rampant in American society in general and worldwide, but may also be more acute in certain immigrant and refugee communities that have limited information sources? How do you make people feel at ease with going to a hospital? Or, it's better if it's obviously a community health center, if it's a trusted location. Maybe a county public health center would be more trusted than a big hospital. They're starting in California to set up FEMA, National Guard, military, federal vaccination centers. Now, I could see why immigrants and refugees who are afraid of ICE might be wary of going to get vaccinated by an arm of the Department of Homeland Security. I think there's going to be work to do to encourage them, notwithstanding any other fears they have getting vaccinated. If they have to share their information because they have to get recontacted and vaccinated twice. That's one issue. The other issue, you know, the last big issue I discussed was the public charge rule and how it affects immigrant refugees' willingness to come forward for benefits. Something in the president's executive order, and we've seen it in other documents already. There was a statement coming out of ICE, is about trying to dispel these fears in immigrant communities, to say that if you come forward for a shot or a treatment or a vaccine, that this is in no way going to affect your ability to get a green card or your family member's ability to get a green card, that ICE is not going to be anywhere near any of the vaccination sites or health facilities, that in fact ICE is going to be far less present in immigrant communities, hopefully. But those messages need to come out from the top, from the federal agencies, not just Department of Homeland Security and ICE, from Health and Human Services, from FEMA, from all the agencies involved. They need to be clear. There needs to be clear guidance about the public charge rule. If you're a U.S. citizen, it doesn't apply to you. If you already have a green card, except in limited circumstances, it doesn't apply to you. If you're a refugee asylee, it doesn't apply to you. It doesn't apply to you on behalf of seeking benefits for U.S. citizen kids. You know, the Trump administration, I think, purposely allowed the misinformation about this rule to get out there to make its effect more dramatic in immigrant communities. There's a lot of damage to be undone. And it's going to be incumbent on not just the federal government, but state and local government entities, public health, the community health centers, all the people who provide health and social services to refugee and immigrant communities to have a clear and consistent message. First, that it's a new day. They don't need to fear the Biden administration the way they did the Trump administration. Second, that there's no grounds for them to be arrested or not get a green card if they use these kind of health services. And I think that you have a unique opportunity with the close connections you have with refugee and immigrant communities locally to test these messages and strategies for delivering them.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working on it. Thank you. The report that you mentioned, Dr. Capps, I know you sent it to me via email this morning, and so I can circulate it. I assume folks can also find it on the Migration Policy Institute's website.
Yes, www.migrationpolicy.org. It's front and center there. That'll be the first thing that comes up.
Great. Any final questions or comments that anyone has been sitting on that they're anxious to ask Dr. Capps before we wind down today? Okay.
You know, I should just say, Ashley, before you close, that we, in tradition with our webinars, are often willing to take questions after the fact. So if people want to email me via you with some burning questions that they didn't get answered, that are a bit narrower, or they didn't want to ask in front of the whole group, I'm happy to engage in further conversations if people are interested in other information and data that we may have available. I'd be happy to do that as well. And I also would kind of like to keep in touch and learn about the good work that you're doing and how successful it is.
Absolutely. Well, and for those of you who are interested in following up with us at the PRC or with Dr. Capps, I've posted our website on the screen here, prc.gsu.edu. There's a place to email us through the website. So please, for those of you who are on the call today who don't have our direct email address, you can go on that website and feel free to contact us, and we will follow up with Dr. Capps and also share the report. And just wanted to extend our gratitude to you, Dr. Capps, for the very informative conversation today. We really appreciate your time. I know I learned a lot from you, so thank you. And want to thank everyone else for attending today.
Well, thanks so much, and let's keep in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you all.